The morning mist still hung over the red earth of the village when Chitalu, small and serious-faced, slipped out of the mud brick house. Her bare feet made soft prints as she knelt beside the straw mat laid in the yard, her hands clasped together. The world around her was still asleep, except for the sky. She believed the sky never slept. That was why she whispered her prayers upward, eyes closed, lips moving in gentle rhythm, as if sharing secrets with the clouds. Her voice was too soft to wake anyone but her father, Okonkwo, noticed. He always did. From his wooden stool by the doorway, he sipped bitter cola and shook his head. Prayers are for cowards, he muttered loud enough for her to hear. Life listens only to power. Not whispers to the sky. Inside the house, her siblings stirred. No one joined her. They never did. Nkem, the eldest, often laughed and called her Sky Talker. Her younger brother, Yugo, sometimes threw pebbles at her when she stayed too long outside. To them, her prayers were strange, not just unnecessary but foolish. But Chitalu never stopped. Each morning, her small voice rose again like incense, unnoticed by the world but steady as dawn. She asked for little things, for her mother's hands to stop aching, for her brother to stop stealing eggs from the neighbor's coop, for the goats to stop eating the yam leaves. She prayed in full sentences, not recitations, as though the sky needed clarity. Her mother, MMA, noticed too, not with scorn but quiet pride. One evening, when Okonkwo had gone to the palm wine shed and the children were asleep, MMA took Chitalu aside. "You talk to the sky like you were born to," she said softly, brushing the child's hair back. Then, from the fold of her wrapper, she pulled out a small red clay bead, still warm from being worn close to her skin. "Keep praying. Even stones crack under rain." Chitalu held it like treasure. That night, as thunder rumbled far away, she knelt again beside the mat, this time clutching the bead tightly in one hand. The wind picked up, swirling dust and loose leaves, and then crack. Lightning struck a mango tree just beyond the compound wall. The sky lit up like a shout. Chitalu gasped. Her eyes widened. The earth had listened. Her father, watching from the doorway, spat and scoffed. "Coincidence?" he muttered. "Trees fall. That's life." But in her heart, the little girl believed the sky had answered. So she kept praying. At 12, Chitalu had grown into a girl who carried more silence than laughter. She was bright, absorbing everything she read or heard, but her words were few and carefully chosen. The only time she spoke freely was during prayer, those early hours before the cock crowed, and again as the sun dipped behind the hills. Her voice would rise in soft cadence, like leaves brushing the wind, steady and sincere. But even that small freedom was no longer hers. Her father had made it clear one evening when he stormed into the hut just as she whispered her usual dusk prayer. "No more of that in my house," he barked, his breath hot with palm wine. "Your gods don't feed us. They don't pay school fees. They don't bring yams to this table." Chitalu had frozen mid-sentence, her hands still clasped, her eyes lowered. Her mother, MMA, sitting in the corner with her head wrapped and legs folded, tried to speak, but Okonkwo silenced her with a glare. The room had fallen into a hush more powerful than thunder. From then on, Chitalu prayed outside. She would kneel beside the old goat shed, or sometimes behind the cassava patch, away from the windows. If it rained, she covered her head with a faded wrapper and kept praying. The soil stained her knees. The dew wet her ankles. But her voice never stopped rising. Her mother's health, once fragile but dependable, began to crack like dry clay. It started with headaches, then fatigue, then long periods when she couldn't rise from the mat. Okonkwo called it female weakness, blaming the weather, bad food, or gossip from neighboring wives. When MMA began coughing, he said it was dust. When the coughing turned wet and heavy, he accused her of harboring spiritual fear. "You follow this girl's shadow prayers too much," he muttered. Chitalu didn't argue. She only knelt longer. She began fasting not just out of faith but desperation. She stopped eating before sunset. She carried a gourd of water to the edge of the forest where the trees grew thickest. There, she prayed among roots and fallen leaves, the clay bead her mother had given her clenched tightly in her palm. "Don't take her," she whispered again and again to the sky. "Take me. Take my breath instead." One afternoon she returned from the forest with dirt on her feet and twigs in her hair, only to hear the worst sound a child can hear from home, a cough so deep and rattling it sounded like the earth choking. She ran inside. Her mother was hunched on the mat, blood streaked across her lips. Her chest heaved like someone drowning. Her wrapper was soaked through with sweat. Chitalu screamed for help. Her father stood in the doorway, unmoved. "You want prayer to be medicine?" he said coldly. "Heal her now, prophet." Baba, please, Chitalu begged, tears slipping down her cheeks. Let's take her to the clinic. Please. Please. He shook his head and left the room. Chitalu wrapped her mother in a dry wrapper and held her close. She placed wet cloths on her forehead, fanned her with her hands and began to pray out loud, not caring any more who heard. Our help comes from you, she whispered again and again. Our help comes from you. But help did not come. Mma's breaths became thinner, her fingers colder. She opened her eyes once, just before the end, and smiled faintly at her daughter. Her lips moved but no sound came. Then her eyes closed for the last time. Chitalu sat still, rocking slowly, her mother in her arms. Outside the skies remained clear. Not a single drop of rain fell. At the funeral, villagers gathered under canopies, fanning themselves as the pastor spoke words of dust and return. Chitalu stood beside the casket, hollow-eyed but dry-faced. Her father stood across from her, dressed in stiff white linen, looking more like a stranger than a mourner. When it was his turn to speak, he did not cry. She wasted her strength on her knees, he said to the crowd, voice bitter and full. Always talking to the sky. That's why we lost her. The words fell like stones. Chitalu didn't speak. She didn't correct him. But as the crowd dispersed and the grave swallowed her mother whole, she knelt beside it one last time. And prayed louder than she ever had before. After her mother was lowered into the ground, silence came into the house like a ghost that never left. It sat at the doorway. It followed them into the kitchen. It climbed into the bed at night. Nothing filled the space Mma once occupied, not words, not movement, not even time. At 13, Chitalu became the woman of the house without being asked. One morning, her father shoved a stack of wrappers into her arms and said, "Your brothers need food." That was the only instruction. From then on, she rose before dawn to fetch water, pounded yam until her arms burned, swept the compound, and bathed her younger siblings when they refused to lift a hand. She did all of this in silence. Not because she didn't want to speak, but because no one listened. Her father, once only stern, had become harsh. He drank every evening, returning home with glassy eyes and sour breath. His anger came in sudden bursts, a slammed door, a thrown cup, a muttered insult. But the worst of his bitterness was reserved for her faith. Your rituals, he spat once, watching her wash her hands before evening prayer. Still at it? Still thinking the sky owes you something? Chitalu said nothing. She had learned that replying only gave him more to tear apart. Instead, she waited until the fire in the cooking hut died down, then slipped quietly behind the compound wall to kneel in the dirt. She whispered with care, her hands folded over the same clay bead, now smoothed by her palm. One night she didn't hear him coming. His shadow loomed before his voice. So this is what you do instead of sleep? She turned, startled, still on her knees. He struck her. The slap came quick, stinging her cheek and spinning her body halfway around. Talk to your sky from the goat shed, he snarled. Let your spirits sleep with the animals. He grabbed her wrist and dragged her to the small wooden enclosure. It reeked of hay and manure. He threw her in, slammed the door and bolted it shut. The goats bleated, annoyed by the intrusion. She sank into a corner, dirt biting into her skin. Her cheek throbbed but she didn't cry. Instead she prayed louder than before. Not for freedom. Not even for mercy. She prayed for transformation. Let this pain break something open, she whispered. If the house has no women's voice, let me be the echo. She stayed there till morning. When the door creaked open with the first light, she stood, brushed the straw from her wrapper, and walked out as if it hadn't broken her. Wordless, she returned to the cooking hut. She stirred ogbono soup while her father snored. She packed her siblings' school lunches. And when she tied her scarf to leave for school, her step did not falter. At school she barely spoke to anyone. But in her notebook she wrote. Quietly, steadily. She wrote poems about storms that never made sound, about rivers that drowned only in dreams. She wrote about women who screamed into pillows, whose names no one remembered. And she wrote about a girl whose father told her the sky was empty, but who filled it with words anyway. A new literature teacher, Miss Igioma, read one of her poems left behind by accident on a desk. The next day she called Chitalu to her desk. You wrote this. Chitalu nodded cautiously. Miss Igioma studied her face then smiled. It's like thunder wrapped in silence. She encouraged her to submit something to the regional poetry competition. Chitalu hesitated. The entry required her father's signature. So she submitted it under her mother's name instead. Weeks later, the school assembly was unusually long. The principal's voice rang out, announcing the winner of the junior poetry category, Chidelu Okonkwo, for her poem titled, "The Mouth of God is a Girl." The students clapped. Some laughed, surprised. Chidelu walked slowly to the front to receive the certificate. Miss Igioma hugged her. That evening she returned home, the certificate folded in her math book. Her heart fluttered, not with pride but with dread. She slipped the paper under her mattress. But her father found it. He read the name, then read the poem. His face twisted in rage. "You embarrass me with this witchcraft," he said. "Writing like you're better than everyone." He tore the certificate once, twice, then flung the pieces into the cooking fire. They caught flame instantly, curling into ash. Chidelu watched it burn. She said nothing. She didn't beg. Later that night, she stepped outside and knelt again, her knees pressing into the same dirt where she had once been punished. And prayed. Not for recognition, not for rescue, but for endurance. Because even in a house with no woman's voice, hers still rose. Unseen. Unheard. But never silent. By 16, Chidelu had mastered the art of making herself small while holding her dreams large. She moved like a whisper through the compound, cooking, scrubbing, mending, but inside something thundered. Each evening, after her chores and the children were asleep, she gathered a few village children under the mango tree and began to teach them numbers and letters on an old blackboard she'd rescued from the market. She charged a small fee, a handful of groundnuts, a cracked egg, a naira note pressed secretly into her palm. She didn't spend it. She kept everything inside a rusted tin beneath the floor mat in her sleeping corner. Week by week the tin filled. Each coin became part of something bigger. A plan. A prayer that took shape slowly. Her father scoffed at her tutoring. "Why are you wasting time with other people's children? You think kneeling and scribbling makes you wise?" he said one night, drunk and laughing. "School is for men who command. You kneel too much to lead." Chidelu didn't respond. She never did anymore. But she kept waking before dawn, lighting her kerosene lantern, and poring over second-hand books given to her by Auntie Easy Eye, the quiet neighbor who had watched her grow since childhood. One morning, Auntie Easy Eye called her over after church and handed her a small parcel wrapped in faded cloth. Inside were worn theology books and a printed form, an application to St. Miriam's Girls' Seminary, a boarding school known for producing pastors, counselors, and teachers. "I knew your mother," Auntie Easy Eye said gently. "She always said your voice would break chains one day. Maybe it's time you used it." Chidelu felt the weight of the pages like a heartbeat in her hands. She filled out the form late at night by candlelight. In the column marked Guardian Consent, she left it blank. She folded it neatly and walked 5 miles to the post office herself, slipping her tuition fee from the rusted tin into the envelope. Then she waited. Weeks passed. The dry season came. Then the rains returned. And one afternoon a letter arrived, folded thick, sealed with an emblem of blue and gold. It was addressed to her. Her fingers trembled as she opened it behind the cooking hut. She read the first line again and again. "We are pleased to inform you." She was accepted. Full scholarship. She ran inside, barefoot, letter pressed to her chest. Her siblings watched her with wide eyes. But her father was seated, tired from a day of drinking. She hesitated, then handed him the letter. His bloodshot eyes scanned it once, twice. And then, without a word, he threw it into the fire pit. The flames licked the edges instantly. "No daughter of mine will go off and become a preacher of lies," he growled. "Better you learn to serve than to speak." Chidelu stared at the fire. At the ashes floating up like dying prayers. Her knees weakened. She stepped outside and sat in the dirt. And for the first time in years she cried. Not from pain. Not even from anger. But because the letter had felt like a doorway, and he had closed it without blinking. That night she didn't pray. Not because she had lost faith, but because she feared her voice might crack in the middle, and she needed to be whole to face what came next. By morning she had wiped her face, fetched water, and returned to her books. She reapplied. She forged a signature. She borrowed a stamp from the head teacher at the school under the pretense of entering a competition. She posted the form again, sealing it with the last of the coins in her tin. This time, when the envelope arrived, she was ready. She hid it beneath her mattress, buried deep between her prayer cloth and an old photo of her mother. She read the letter in pieces, memorized the details. Term begins August 4th. Orientation required. Uniforms to be collected at campus. She didn't tell a soul, not even Auntie Easy Eye. Not until the night before her departure, when she crept into the woman's backyard with a single bag slung over her shoulder. Inside the bag were just 4 things: her Bible, a lined notebook with pages half filled with sermons and verses, her mother's clay bead tied to a ribbon and one spare wrapper. Auntie Easy Eye didn't ask questions. She simply held her face and whispered, "Go. And don't look back until you've made something the world can't burn." The sky was still dark when Chidaloo left the village. The road was soft from last night's rain. She didn't know what waited ahead. But for the first time, her prayers were not whispered, they were alive in her steps. And the girl who once cried in silence now walked into the world with nothing to protect her, except her calling. At St. Miriam's Girls' Seminary, everything felt like a world stitched from a fabric Chidaloo had never touched. The buildings were tall and bright, the classrooms buzzed with polished voices, and the girls wore matching uniforms with polished shoes that clicked confidently down the marble corridors. Chidaloo arrived with only one spare wrapper, her Bible wrapped tightly in it, and a silence deeper than most would notice. She barely spoke for the first few weeks. Her village accent curled awkwardly around her words, and when she answered questions in class, some of the girls stifled laughter. One, with glossy hair and a Lagos drawl, mimicked her behind her back. "Yes, sister," she would say in exaggerated tones, making the others giggle. Chidaloo heard them but said nothing. She had survived worse. Instead she listened, watched, prayed quietly in corners, not from fear but from habit. Slowly, the silence that others thought was weakness became presence. In the library she always had the answers. In chapel, her eyes closed not with boredom but with communion. When a girl in her dormitory cried after a call from home, Chidaloo sat beside her, didn't ask questions, just held her hand until the tears stopped. It was that calm that first drew the attention of Sister Agnes. Sister Agnes was one of the older teachers, soft-spoken but always watching. She called Chidaloo into her office one afternoon after a theology class and offered her a seat beside a small bookshelf crammed with journals. "You know more scripture than many girls who've been here longer," she said, leafing through Chidaloo's essay on Ruth. "But you speak like you've lived it." Chidaloo didn't know what to say. No teacher had ever said anything like that to her before. Sister Agnes offered her mentorship, time to study deeper theology, writing assignments, and guidance on speaking publicly. It was under her wing that Chidaloo wrote her first full sermon, "Faith When No One Sees You." It wasn't flashy. It wasn't loud. But it was true. She wrote of mothers who carried burdens silently, girls who prayed under locked roofs, a faith that didn't need a witness to be powerful. When Sister Agnes read it, she shared it with the local parish. Soon, copies were being read in 3 churches nearby. One Sunday the head chaplain read it aloud during Mass, and the name Chidaloo Okonkwo echoed through the pews. She didn't smile. She only bowed her head. Because now the words were not hers, they belonged to those who had none. But even as her new world began to recognize her, her old one stirred with unrest. Back in the village, Okonkwo had begun to cough. At first he ignored it. He was still strong, he said. Just a cold or maybe dust. But the cough didn't leave. It deepened, darkened. He spat blood into old rags and still refused to see the doctor until his legs began to weaken beneath him. Finally he went. The clinic found nothing. They gave him bitter herbs and chalky tablets. But the illness grew worse. At night, the neighbors could hear him retching. Some whispered that he had wronged someone spiritually. "Maybe it's her," one said. "The girl. The one who prays." Someone else scoffed, "But she only kneels and whispers. How could she bring down a man like that?" Okonkwo heard the rumors. One morning, in a fit of pain and fury, he muttered to his sons, "Maybe this is her revenge. Maybe the sky listened after all." He said it like a joke. But his eyes betrayed fear. Then came the night when he coughed blood into his palms, thick, red, and too much. His breathing became ragged, his skin turned pale. The family gathered, panicked. He asked to see his children. His sons were called. His nephews. Even a cousin who lived 2 towns away. But not Chidaloo. He didn't speak her name. He didn't have to. The silence was loud. She heard anyway. Auntie Easy Eye sent word in a folded note tucked inside a church donation envelope delivered to the seminary. "Your father is very sick. They say he may not last the week." Chidaloo held the note between trembling fingers. She didn't cry. She didn't react outwardly. She simply folded it back, slid it between the pages of her Bible, and went to chapel. That night, as rain tapped against the stained glass windows and the dorms fell quiet, she knelt on the cold stone floor. Her knees had hardened over the years. Her voice, still soft, held no hesitation. She didn't pray for revenge. She didn't even pray for healing. She prayed for truth. For a heart to be opened before it was silenced. For mercy on a man who never showed it. She whispered the name of her father not with bitterness, but with hope. The kind that only comes when you've survived a storm long enough to become one. The village had not changed much, but the silence that greeted Chidaloo as she stepped off the bus felt heavier than before. She didn't announce her arrival. She didn't wait to be welcomed. She simply walked the long red path to the house that had once felt like a cage and now stood like a collapsing shrine to all that had gone wrong. The compound was quiet. Her younger siblings, now taller, paused mid-step when they saw her enter. One of her brothers called out cautiously, "Chidaloo?" She nodded. Their eyes widened with a mix of relief and unease. They hadn't expected her, certainly not now. Inside the main room, her father lay on a raffia mat, too weak to rise. He had shrunk. His bones pushed against his skin, and the cough had carved deep hollows into his face. But his voice, however rasped, still carried the sharpness of old pride. "I didn't ask for you," he croaked as she stepped into the room. Chidaloo didn't flinch. She placed her small bag in the corner, walked past the doorframe and sat beside him. "I came anyway," she said softly. He turned his face away. She sat there in silence, her hands folded in her lap. Then, without asking, she bowed her head and began to pray aloud. Her voice was calm, deliberate. She prayed for mercy, for forgiveness, for a heart that had hurt because it did not know how to hold love. She prayed not to change her father, but to steady herself in the middle of his storm. He cursed. Not loudly. Just enough to spit the words into the room like ash. But he didn't stop her. And that was enough. She stayed. Over the next few days she fell into a rhythm her body remembered too well. Cooking soft yam and egusi soup, washing his clothes, wiping his forehead with cool cloths in the evenings. Her siblings watched quietly from doorways, unsure if this was redemption or madness. When he soiled himself one afternoon, she didn't hesitate. She cleaned him, spoke gently as if he were a child learning to be human again. He said nothing, not even a grunt of protest. That evening she sat beside him and opened the book of Psalms. Her voice wove through the verses, sometimes trembling, sometimes strong. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." At night she slept on a mat just outside his door. And in one dream she saw her mother, standing beside the mango tree, smiling as if something lost had returned. By the fourth day something shifted. Her father turned his head as she fed him porridge and rasped, "You still believe your prayers can save anything?" Chidaloo looked up. "Not always," she replied. "But they still reach the one who can." He didn't argue. Later that evening, while she swept the compound, he spoke again, not loud, just enough to reach her over the sound of the broom bristles. "Why do you still pray for me?" She paused. The question hung in the air like incense, unexpected, unfamiliar, full of weight. She walked to him, kneeling beside his mat. "Because I was trained by someone who loved you," she said. "Even when you couldn't love her." His face twitched. His eyes glistened. He tried to blink it away, but the tears came anyway, not loud or desperate, just quiet and steady like rain soaking into dry ground. He turned his head fully to look at her, not through her but at her, as if seeing her for the first time. "Chidaloo," he whispered. No bitterness. No sarcasm. Just her name. She exhaled softly. It was the first time he had said it without mockery. In that moment she didn't see a broken man, or a father who had crushed her voice so many times. She saw a soul, fragile, cracked but still there. And for the first time in her life she felt like a daughter who had not just returned home, but been received. The morning after her father said her name without mockery, Chidaloo rose with a new kind of strength. The silence between them had shifted, not filled with affection but no longer sharpened by scorn. That was enough. She stepped outside, lifted her phone and made a call. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Dr. Ozioma, a volunteer physician who had once visited her seminary for a health lecture on neglected tropical diseases. Chidaloo had spoken with him afterward, asked questions, taken notes. He had given her his contact just in case. Now she used it. "Doctor," she said softly, "it's Chidaloo. From St. Miriam's. I need help. My father, he's dying." After a brief silence, he responded, "Where are you?" Within 2 days, a dusty sedan rolled into the village, surprising even the head elder. A man in jeans and a white shirt stepped out with a medical bag. Dr. Ozioma entered the small, dim room where Chidaloo's father lay and examined him with quiet professionalism. He asked questions, took notes, drew blood. Afterward, he sat outside with Chidaloo beneath the mango tree. "It's a rare but treatable respiratory infection," he said. "Most likely caught and ignored for too long." His lungs are damaged but not beyond healing, if he gets the right care and consistency. Chidaloo nodded, her face calm, her heart beating hard. I'll treat him, the doctor added. But I need someone who won't let him fall through the cracks. You already have that person, she said. Over the next weeks, Chidaloo became nurse, guardian, and steward of both medicine and faith. She administered hospital-prescribed antibiotics in the mornings, herbal steam in the evenings, and a blend of bitter leaves and honey midday, a method passed down by her mother. Every dose began with a prayer. At first, her father frowned, turned his head, refused to respond. But he didn't push her away. He grew quieter with each passing day. And as the medicine began to clear his lungs, Chidaloo noticed something else, the way he looked at her now, not with contempt but with wonder. Or perhaps guilt. One afternoon, as she knelt to help him sit up, he whispered, "Are you praying again?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. He nodded. Then, "Pray louder." So she did. That night, he joined her, awkwardly, haltingly, like a man learning to walk in darkness with only a flickering lantern. He stumbled over the words, misquoted scriptures. But he tried. She never corrected him. She simply prayed alongside him, slowly, steadily, like teaching a child to read. Soon, neighbors noticed his voice joining hers during evening devotions. Word spread. A man once known for laughing at faith now bowed beside his daughter. The healer came again for a checkup. This time her father sat up unaided. His lungs are improving, the doctor said. And his spirit seems healed in other ways too. Chidaloo offered a small smile. Her father only nodded. In time her father began to walk again. First short steps around the yard, then to the gate, then all the way to the village square, leaning on a stick but upright. When he arrived that first time, in daylight, no longer carried or coughing, the village paused. Elders stared. Women whispered. Children looked up from games. They had seen him near death. And now he stood. "Is it true?" one woman asked another. Was it her prayers? Another replied, "It must be. What else could bring a man back from the edge?" A week later, during the village's monthly gathering in the town hall, her father did something no one expected. He stood before the crowd. And he apologized. His voice cracked as he spoke. "I used to think her prayers were weakness," he began, eyes lowered. "I mocked her when she prayed. I told her she would never lead, never matter." He looked up directly at Chidaloo seated in the back. "But she was the one who carried me when I had no strength. She healed me with care and with faith." The crowd fell silent. "She saved me." Chidaloo didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. But her expression was steady. Oh, she had not come for revenge or even redemption. She had come because she believed in healing. And now that belief stood beside her, breathing, alive. The same father who once locked her in the goat shed now bowed his head beside hers. Not because he had been forced to believe, but because her love, stitched in prayer, soaked in patience, had become the very medicine that saved him. The village church had never been so full. Word had spread over the past few months, not just about Okonkwo's miraculous recovery, but about the girl who had once been silenced, mocked, and dismissed. The same girl was now being invited to give the Sunday sermon. Chidaloo stood at the edge of the pulpit, her Bible pressed to her chest, her eyes calm. She wore a simple white dress sewn by her own hand, and around her wrist, she had tied a thin strip of her late mother's wrapper, faded but powerful. Behind her, the choir hummed softly. In front of her, the pews were packed. Mothers, children, elders, even teenagers who rarely came to service unless it involved drums. And in the back corner, leaning on a walking stick, stood her father. She didn't look at him directly, but she felt his presence, like a weight that had shifted, finally settling into something gentler. When she spoke, her voice didn't shake. It flowed. "My sermon today," she began, "is called, 'When the Mockers Are the Ones Who Need Mercy.'" A few people murmured. Some raised eyebrows. She smiled. "Many of us have been mocked. For our faith, for our differences, for choosing gentleness when the world demands hardness. I was told prayer was a waste of time. That kneeling was weakness. That silence was surrender. But God was listening, even when no one else was." She paused. Her voice softened. "And sometimes, those who mock us are not truly laughing. They're bleeding, lost, terrified to kneel because it means letting go of control. They hurt others because they are wounded themselves." She turned slightly, not enough to face her father, but enough that he knew these words were for him. "My father once said I wasted time on my knees. But it was on my knees that I learned to stand." A quiet gasp rippled through the room. He used to mock prayer, she continued. Now he prays beside me. She didn't tell stories of her suffering. She didn't mention the goat shed or the burned letters, or the bruises that had long since faded. She spoke only of healing, of second chances, of mercy that blooms when we choose to water it, no matter how dry the land has been. When the sermon ended, there was no clapping. Only silence, thick with reverence. Her father stood at the back, weeping into his hands. After that day everything changed. Chidelu did not return to seminary immediately. She stayed. Not because she had to, but because there was work to do. She started a village prayer circle. At first, only 3 widows came, quiet women with grief worn like old wrappers. Then 2 teenage girls joined. Then a boy. Then more. They met beneath the mango tree her mother once loved, sitting on mats, praying aloud, singing softly. They shared food, stories, and scriptures. No one was turned away. Not the orphaned. Not the mocked. Not even those who had once ridiculed her. One day her father came to her carrying a folded piece of paper. "I want to give this," he said, holding it out. "Your mother's old farmland. The one by the stream." Chidelu looked up, surprised. "For what?" "For a school," he said. "A small one. For girls like you. For boys too. But especially for the ones people think are not worth teaching." He hesitated, then added, "I want to call it MMA House. After her." Chidelu's breath caught. MMA had been her mother's nickname. It meant beautiful. They built the school together, starting with bamboo, corrugated sheets, and faith. Villagers donated benches, books, and labor. Her father oversaw construction with a passion Chidelu had never seen before. And every Sunday he now walked beside her to church, clean, quiet, changed. He even began speaking during men's gatherings, urging others to listen to their daughters. To pray. To give space to grace. One night, as the sun dipped low and the compound filled with the scent of boiling yam, her father sat beside her outside. They listened to the cicadas, the crackle of the cooking fire, the laughter of her siblings inside. "I wish I had listened sooner," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Chidelu didn't respond immediately. She reached for his hand, the same hand that had once slapped her for praying, and held it gently. "The sky hears us," she said, "even when no one else does." They sat together in the stillness. Then, slowly he closed his eyes. She did too. And together, father and daughter, once enemies of spirit, began to pray side by side. Not with fear. Not with shame. But with gratitude. The house that had once swallowed her voice had become a sanctuary. A house of second chances. The banners fluttered in the wind, draped across buildings and billboards. National Prayer Conference, guest speaker, Reverend Chidelu Mmea Okonkwo. Her face, serene and glowing, was everywhere. Bus stops, newspapers, phone screens. A woman once silenced in her own home was now a voice sought across the nation. Inside the grand prayer hall, thousands gathered, women with geli wrapped in royal colors, men in kaftans, youth with notepads and eager eyes. The air vibrated with worship songs and anticipation. Among the crowd, near the front but tucked slightly to the side, sat an old man in a spotless white kaftan. His hands trembled not from age alone but from awe. Okonkwo wept silently as his daughter walked onto the stage, flanked by ushers and a choir humming "Amazing Grace." He had watched her from afar as her name rose in circles he once believed she'd never enter. He had cheered for her in private before finding the courage to do so in public. And now, here he was, one among thousands, witnessing what only the sky and a prayerful girl could have imagined. Reverend Chidelu took her place at the podium. The lights dimmed slightly. The crowd quieted. She began not with a shout but a whisper. "There were days," she said, "when I prayed with no voice, no certainty, no approval. I was told my prayers were worthless. I was locked away for kneeling. I cried into pillows so no one would hear. But the sky," she paused, raising her gaze, "the sky was listening." Applause rippled through the hall. "Some of us," she continued, "prayed in silence. But even silence can split stones. Silence can move hearts. Silence, given to God, becomes thunder." Her father buried his face in his hands and wept openly, unashamed. In the front row, a small girl with cornrows and a simple dress clutched a clay prayer bead, just like the one Chidelu used to carry, worn and faded. Her eyes were wide, not in fear but in wonder. She leaned forward, absorbing every word as if it had been spoken just for her. Reverend Chidelu ended her message with a soft invitation, not to shout, not to fight, but to believe. To dare to be seen. To kneel even when mocked, because heaven never misses a bowed head. That evening, long after the crowd had dispersed, Chitterloo returned to the place where it all began. The forest trail was quieter now, overgrown in parts. But her feet remembered the way. She reached the old tree, once struck by lightning the same year her mother died. The bark still bore the scar, a jagged line of charcoal down its side. She laid her Bible at the base, removed her shoes and knelt. The forest whispered with wind and cicadas. Her fingers dug into the earth. Her heart beat slow and sure. No audience. No microphone. No applause. Just her. And the sky. She closed her eyes. And prayed, not for miracles but in gratitude. For survival. For transformation. For the girl she once was. Final line, the sky remembered the girl they tried to silence, and gave her thunder as a voice.